On April 8th, 2024, I had the chance to shoot a total solar eclipse from my backyard using a Nikon Z8 and the Nikon 600mm f4. After preparing for 6 months, including practicing with the 2023 annular eclipse, I was able to get the shots I was seeking. However, things didn't go exactly as planned, and for the last 3 weeks I've been mentally preparing for the next total eclipse by evaluating what went well, what didn't go well, and my lessons learned. Before we get into the lessons that I learned shooting a total solar eclipse, let's talk a little bit about my setup. To get the close-up images of the sun, I used a Nikon Z8 paired with a Nikon Z 600mm f4 super telephoto lens. For my settings for the photos, every photo I took used a set of 5 bracketed images. I used an ISO of 100 and I kept my aperture set at f8. Additionally, and able to fire all 5 of those bracketed shots, I had my camera set to a continuous 8 shooting mode for use with my intervalometer. To keep the lens pointed at the sun, I used my Ioptron Skyguider Pro on top of a tripod. In order to keep the tripod from moving, one thing that I did that I don't normally do, and in fact have never done, is I put the spikes on my tripod. And this allowed me to keep the tripod securely in place. In order to make sure that each of my photos fired at the correct time and kept within sequences of the lead up to the totality, I used a wireless intervalometer. On the intervalometer, I had it set up to take an exposure of 20 seconds with an interval of 10 seconds. So that meant no matter how long I needed an exposure to be, using a continuous 8 shooting, that all 5 shots would always fire during that 20-second period. And then the 10-second interval would get me to a 30-second overall interval between each set of shots, which this is what I was going for, trying to take a photo every 30 seconds in the lead up to totality and after totality. In order to make sure that I didn't miss anything during totality, I actually stopped taking the photos before and after at plus and minus 3 minutes from first contact and fourth contact during the eclipse. This gave me time to make sure that I got the camera settings changed leading up to totality, and then got the camera settings changed back to what I needed for after totality, without losing a whole lot in the overall time lapse that I was wanting to shoot. During totality, rather than having to rely on the intervalometer, I just used it to hold down the shutter release button that was on it to let it fire through my succession of 5 bracketed shots every time with the new settings that I had changed to for totality. One of the most important pieces of equipment that I used during the eclipse was my solar filter. This filter was made out of a cardboard box and some 12x12 filter paper that I purchased over on Amazon. And this is one of the most important pieces to make sure that you don't damage your sensor. As I mentioned, I shot all of these photos using a Nikon Z8. And the Z8 is known to have a short battery life on the battery that's provided with it. So in order to combat that, since I knew I was going to be shooting over roughly a 3-hour period, since I was just shooting at my house, I decided to run AC power out to the camera and run it just off of a power supply. And that meant that I never had to change batteries throughout the eclipse. And the final item that I used in my setup was actually a laptop. This was a setup call that I made actually after the eclipse had started, and this allowed me to monitor what the camera was seeing through a USB cable, and also allowed the people that were watching the event with me get to see it as well. So if you made it this far into the video and you like it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd smash the like button down below. Also, if you want to see more content like this in the future and help me get to the point where I can be monetized and continue to create more content like this, please be sure to hit the subscribe button down below, and you'll be one of the first ones to see that content. Let's talk about what went well during the eclipse. So the very first thing that I thought about doing the night before was to actually set up my tripod and get the star tracker aligned when I could actually use the North Star to align it. This was a big step up from what I did during the 2023 annular eclipse, where I showed up in the morning with no visibility on the stars and just had to align using a compass and knowing the latitude to get it somewhat relative in alignment. And that meant that every 30 to 40 minutes I was having to adjust the camera to keep the sun within the sensor. But because I aligned the night before with the total eclipse, and the best part about this was that because I put the tripod with the spikes outside, the alignment was never lost throughout the night. I also had 0 issues getting the camera in focus on the 8th, and this was because I had practiced multiple times in days leading up to the eclipse, and this helped me to get the sharp images that I got. Another thing that went really well with my setup was I managed to time the diamond rings perfectly, and I was also able to get pictures of the solar flares. Additionally, because I shot with 5 bracketed photos, The third photo I was after, which was an HDR image, that also came out great. I know myself included and everybody else was worried about how the clouds were going to affect totality, and I know that I would have loved to have had clear skies, but the images that I got that have the thin, high clouds are actually some of my favorite of the entire Eclipse sequence that I've photographed, mostly just because of the character that it adds to the photos. And to wrap up what went well during the Eclipse, one of the greatest things that I did was to write down all of the different photos that I wanted to take and at exactly which time that those features were going to occur with the eclipse. I took that sheet of paper and I taped it onto the table that I had set up outside. And being able to reference that was both great for myself, but also my family and friends that throughout the event were wondering what was coming next. So I know it sounds like everything was just great for me shooting. However, there were several things that didn't go well. The first one being that the weight of my Z8 and the Nikon Z 600mm lens combined was right at the maximum allowable weight for my star tracker. So because of this, it made balancing extremely difficult to make sure that the gears could handle it. And at one point before totality, I actually had the gear slip and I had to scramble to try to get the lens pointed back at the sun. And I definitely lost time during that sequence. But I know for a fact that I definitely had some gaps during my time lapse that I was hoping to compile. One item that I wish I had done better during totality was to shoot at one stop darker. And this is because the photos that I got, I feel like blew out the solar flares just a little bit. So having one stop lower, I think would have made those images perfect. The next item that could have gone better is really a fault of the Nikon Z8. The Z8 is known for getting a high temperature warning whenever you've got video shooting for a long time. However, I was not shooting video and I just got the first warning, not the one that actually shuts the camera off, but just letting me know that the memory card was getting hot. And at that point, I had to go run into my garage and find a box fan and figure out a way to set it up so that I could cool the camera down and prevent the full overheat. And finally, the last thing that didn't go well is that the filter that I made was just a little too snug on the lens hood for the lens. Trying to take it off quickly as totality began and also getting it back on were really difficult and actually caused me to lose my tracking of the sun at the end of totality, which again cost me time to go reorient the lens after totality, and I lost more of the time-lapse photos. I want to take a quick moment to thank lensrentals.com for providing me with the equipment to make this video. If you're ever in the need of a camera or video equipment for a special job, or just don't feel like buying something yet and want to test it out, I highly recommend them for short-term rentals. In my mind, they are the leaders in the US-based camera rental business due to their incredible customer service, fast shipping, superb packaging, and willingness to ensure that you get the right equipment you need. If you're finding yourself wanting to rent the 600mm f4 lens to give it a try out before purchasing it, please be sure to check out the link down below that'll take you over to lensrentals.com where they can set you up with a rental. So going through all of those, one thing that I really like to do is look back on the lessons that I learned and make sure that I use those to improve for the next time. Hopefully in the coming years, I'll get to experience another total solar eclipse. And because of that, I want to make sure I've got it documented and have something I can go back to refresh my memory when I get to that point. So the first lesson learned for me is that whenever I'm using a high-weighted system, meaning that the combo of the camera and the lens were near the maximum weight of the star tracker, is to do multiple checks to really make sure that I've got the camera balanced correctly on the tracker. Along with that is making sure that I've got the clutch extremely tight. I really think that the gear slipped because the clutch wasn't tight enough. The second lesson learned is that I need to go a stop darker during my exposures during totality, and that's to make sure that I get clean images of the solar flares. The third lesson learned is to keep a fan around if I'm shooting in full sunlight with the Z8 for another solar eclipse. The camera obviously gets hot and struggles dissipating that heat, so even if I just have a small USB camera that can blow air over the top of the memory card, it's going to help make sure that I don't run into any high heat warnings. The fourth lesson learned for me is to make sure that there's a little bit of play within the solar filter that I'm using. And that's to make it easier to take off the filter and put the filter back on without losing any of your photos of the sun and having to realign the lens. And the final lesson learned, totality goes by extremely quick. I can't express how much I had heard it over and over again that it's going to be chaos trying to shoot it. One, because you got the time crunch, and two, because you're just trying to also enjoy the event. And I have to admit, it was absolutely wild. And I don't think any of the videos that I watched or any of the publications that I read could have prepared me for what that felt like. But the good thing is, going into the next total eclipse that I'll hopefully get to see, I'll understand more of that now. So wrapping this video up, I hope this video helps you if you're on your way to go shoot a total solar eclipse at some point in the future. You want to know what worked well for me, what didn't work well for me, and what I learned through my process. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd smash the like button down below. And like I said earlier, please be sure to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. As always, I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.